Now we're into book 4 in the Francis Tucket series. This is Tucket's Gold by Gary Paulson. Here we go, the first and second chapter, I think. If there was one thing Francis Tucket knew with certainty, it was that death, brutal death, was close to taking them. Dawn was coming, and here he was, a 15-year-old boy in charge of 2 children, walking across a sun-beaten, airless plain that seemed to be endless. Francis, Lottie, and Billy had no food or water or any immediate hope of getting any, and at any moment a dozen or two of the dirt meanest men Francis had ever seen in a world full of mean men could come riding up on them, and he didn't finish the thought. There was no need. Besides, in surviving Indian fights, blizzards, gun battles, and thieves, he had learned the primary rule about danger. It would come if it would come. You could try to be ready for it. You could plan on it. You could even expect it, but it would come when it wanted to come. Lottie and Billy understood this rule too. He had found them sitting in a wagon on a prairie all alone. Their father had died of cholera, and their wagon train had abandoned the family afraid of disease. Lottie had been 9 then, Billy 6. Francis hadn't thought he and the children would stay together long. After all, he had to keep searching for his own family. He'd been separated from them over a year before when Pawnees had kidnapped him from the wagon train on the Oregon Trail. But Francis and Lottie and Billy, well, they were used to each other. They stuck together. Unlike Francis and Jason Grimes, the one-armed mountain man, Jason Grimes had rescued Francis from the Pawnees and taught him how to survive in the West on his own. Then they'd parted ways until last night. Last night, when Grimes had helped them to escape from the Comancheros. The Comancheros were an outlaw band, ruthless and terrifying, inhumanely tough. To escape, Grimes had had to take the pack horses Francis and Lottie and Billy had been riding and lead them off empty, hoping the Comancheros would follow his tracks westward while the 3 children headed north on foot in the dark of night. It was a decent plan. It was their only plan, and it seemed to be working. As Francis and the 2 children had moved north in the dark, they had seen the Comancheros ride past them after Mr. Grimes tracking the horses. The Comancheros had missed the footprints of the children, partly because it was hard to see them, and partly because Francis made Lottie and Billy walk in each other's footprints. He came last, brushing out the trail with a piece of mesquite behind him. But luck was the major factor in the plan. If the Comancheros caught Grimes or even got within sight of him, they'd know that Francis and the children weren't with him. They'd turn and come back for the children. Children meant real money because they could be sold or traded into slavery. Francis knew that brushing out the track would only work in the pitch dark of night. In daylight, the brush marks themselves would be easy to follow. I'm tired. Billy stopped suddenly. I think we've gone far enough. Francis frowned. When Francis had first met Billy, the boy wouldn't say a word, and now he'd gone from never talking at all to complaining. If they catch us, Lottie slapped Billy's head so hard Francis thought he heard the boy's brains rattle. They'll skin you. They'll make a tobacco pouch out of you and let the coyotes have the rest. Now keep walking. If we don't keep moving, they'll be on us like dogs, won't they, Francis? On us just like dogs. Lottie loved to talk, would talk all the time if she had the chance. Seemed to have been talking since Francis had found her in that wagon. Lottie would explain every little detail of every little part of every little thing she was talking about so that not a single aspect of it was missed, and she sometimes drove Francis over the edge. Now, as Billy started moving again, Francis picked up the pace, pushed them as hard as they could stand it, and then harder, and Lottie didn't have breath left to speak. Dawn brought the sun, and the sun brought the heat. Francis and the children were bareheaded, and the sun quickly went to work on them. Billy wanted to complain, especially as the morning progressed, and there was no water, and the sun rose higher and became hotter, but Francis drove them until Billy began to weave. Then Francis handed Lottie his rifle, and pushing her in front of him, he picked Billy up and carried him piggyback mile after mile, then yard after yard, and finally step after step. Lottie saw it first. There, she said. See the spot? Francis was near dead with exhaustion. He had hardly slept at all for the 2 nights before and had been used roughly by the Comancheros in the bargain. He was close to the breaking point as he said, What spot? There. No, more to the right, on the horizon. It's trees. I'm sure of it. A stand of trees. They had seen many mirages, images of trees and water that were not there, but Francis looked where she was pointing and saw it instantly. He stopped and set Billy down. The boy was asleep, and he collapsed in a heap, still sleeping. You're right, trees, and trees mean water. He turned and studied the horizon. He hadn't been able to look up when carrying Billy, and he was shocked now to see a plume of dust off to the west and south. It was at least 15 miles away, against some hills in the distance. It was so far away that it seemed tiny, but Francis knew it was probably caused by riders, many riders. Lottie saw him staring. Could it be buffalo? She watched the dust. A small herd? Not here, Francis thought. Not here in this dust and heat with no grass and no water. Buffalo wouldn't be that stupid. Sure, it's buffalo. You're lying, she sighed. I can tell when you're lying to me, Francis Tucket. It's them, isn't it? Francis said nothing, but his mind was racing. So the riders were heading back eastward. But why would they be coming back so soon? Had they caught and killed Grimes already? If so, they'd be looking for the children. Or had they given up the chase and just seen Grimes and found that he was alone and turned back, still looking for the children? Well, Francis had his rifle, and he was ready. He would get 2, maybe 3 of them before they were on him, and maybe that would discourage them, or they might miss the tracks. He knew this was a vain hope. There hadn't been a breath of wind to blow the dust over the brush marks he'd left, and undoubtedly they had men who were good trackers, men who were alive because they could track mice over rocks. So the Comancheros would find them, and he'd get 1 or 2, and then he looked at the trees, which were about 2 miles away. He could carry Billy there. They could get to the trees in time. Then what? The riders would keep coming back until they came to the place where Francis and the children had turned off about 9 miles back. They would see the marks and turn and start north. 9 miles. The horses would be tired, but they would make 10 miles an hour. They had to ride maybe 20 miles back to the turn, and then 9 or 10 miles north after the children. He let the figures work through his tired brain. Maybe 4 hours, but more likely 3. The riders would be on them in 3 hours. Francis and Billy and Lottie would need an hour to make the trees, and then nothing. It would all just happen later. He'd get 1 or 2 of them, and then they'd get him and take the children, and nothing would have changed, except that a few horses would be very tired, and he, Francis, would be dead if he was lucky. He did not want to think of what they would do with him if they caught him alive. And as for what would happen to Lottie and Billy, his heart grew cold. But there was something else back there, more than just the plume of dust. There was a cloud. At first it was low in the horizon. It showed only as a gray line, so low that Francis almost didn't see it, but it was growing rapidly, the wind bringing it from the west, and as it grew and rose, he could see that it was the top edge of a thunderhead. It didn't look like salvation, not at first. He had seen plenty of prairie thunderheads, but as he watched it, he realized 2 things. 1, it was growing rapidly, roaring along on the high winds, coming toward them at a much faster rate than the horses of the Comancheros. 2, it would bring rain. Rain that would ease their thirst and cool their burning bodies, and far more important, rain that would wipe out their tracks, erase everything that they had left behind them. Still, it was a race, and nothing was sure. The clouds had to keep coming to beat the horsemen to where the children's tracks turned north, and it had to rain. If the clouds turned off and didn't beat the Comancheros or didn't leave rain, then distance was all the children had. They needed to get to the trees and build some kind of defense. Francis picked up Billy, who was still sound asleep and seemed to weigh a ton. He set off at a shambling walk, abandoning the tedious brushing in their race to get to the trees. Lottie shuffled ahead, carrying the rifle and Francis's possibles bag. She was wearing a ragged shift so dirty it seemed to be made of earth. Her yellow hair was full of dust. Francis wore buckskins, but the children only had what was left of their original clothing and what they'd managed to pick up along the way. We're a sight, Francis thought, a ragtag mob of a sight. He looked at the trees, and they didn't seem any closer. He looked at the cloud, and it was still building, though it seemed to be heading off slightly to the south. He looked at the dust plume, and it was still moving in the same line eastward, getting ready to cross their trail. He looked back to the trees and thought, I would absolutely kill for that old mule we had, but the mule had been taken by the Comancheros. Well, that was chapter 1. I think we're going to have to leave it there. And I want to read chapter 2 so bad. Well, we'll pick it up next time. Bye.